Tyrants, one of the Umbrella Corporation's most successful and devastating BOWs to have ever been created, being a staple in the numerous Resident Evil games and movies where they showed off their countless abilities, and always being that constant antagonist for our characters to overcome. So in this video, we'll be doing a quick summary on some of the most prominent Tyrants in the Resident Evil series, where we cover the origins of these monsters, and up to the famous and tension-filling Tyrant we see in Resident Evil 3 Remake with Nemesis. So sit back and relax as we quickly delve in each of these behemoths. But before we do get started with the video, I just want to say my name is HeyDeva, and I do cover a lot of Resident Evil and other survival horror content on my channel. So if you guys enjoy these types of videos, then please feel free to like and subscribe for more content like this in the future. And also possibly adding me both on Instagram and on Twitter, where you guys can message me there personally at any time. Alright, so let's go all the way back to the very beginning of the Resident Evil lore and quickly summarize how these Tyrants came to be, where its origins started way back with the discovery of the progenitor virus, where the founding fathers of the Umbrella Corporation, James Marcus, Edward Ashford, and Oswald E. Spencer located the extremely rare flower called the Stairway of the Sun, a flower highly coveted by the people of the Kijuju region of West Africa, having a history of the Indipia tribesmen consuming these plants, but would have a high mortality rate. But every so often, one individual would survive after eating this rare plant and would gain superhuman strength and increased intelligence, which already foreshadows some of the Tyrant's characteristics later on in the Resident Evil lore. So with the Umbrella's founding fathers learning about this trait, they saw to it that they would extract the very aspect that can cause the numerous benefits that was seen with the Indipia tribe members who survived eating this plant, discovering that a retrovirus within this flower was produced under the exact same conditions within the western region of Africa, and would serve as a base foundation to the progenitor virus and later on the T-virus, which then moves us a couple of decades into the future, with one of the founding fathers decided to combine leech DNA with the progenitor virus and finally creating the T-virus, finally acquiring the means of mass producing its BOWs or bioorganic weapons, because one of the Umbrella Corporation's main goals were to produce as many of these BOWs as possible and sell them off to the US military, which would help fund the Wesker Project, a project envisioned by Oswald E. Spencer to create a superior breed of human beings that would help him become the god of this new world.
I was to become a god.
But before any of that could ever happen, the BOWs that Umbrella would create needed to be efficient, powerful, controllable, and at the same time still retain intelligence, which now brings us to the very beginning of the creation of the Tyrants, which was supposed to be these highly intelligent BOWs that would serve under the commands of the orders of its users. But at first, Umbrella had a difficult time producing the desired Tyrants that they wanted due to the T-virus being known to cause necrosis of the brain, with the only factor to survive this aspect was to find an individual who would be genetically compatible of being a Tyrant, which at first was a difficult task at hand, with the odds of finding said individual only being 1 in 10 million, but with some luck, the Umbrella Corporation was able to find a viable subject, and this individual would serve as one of the Umbrella's top executives, which his name was Sergei Vladimir. So with a person viable of being a Tyrant now available, the next step was to clone his genetic makeup, erasing the problem of looking for another candidate, which now brings us to the Tyrants themselves, and how each iteration would improve from its earlier models, because between the years of the 1980s and to the 1990s, the project to create the perfect Tyrant has already begun, with the earliest model being shown was the T-001, better known as the Proto-Tyrant. A monstrous humanoid behemoth who would later serve as a foundation on how not to create a Tyrant due to his many physical imperfections, with his body littered with necrotic tissue, his spinal column completely exposed, and the undesired twitch movement it produces. But even with all these small defects, this Tyrant was still very capable physically to stand its ground, being over 8 feet tall and having a large claw on his right hand, where in Resident Evil 0, it showed off how devastating and fast it can be with its attacks. But the next model would improve upon the Proto-Tyrant and actually being the final boss in the classic RE1, which was known as the T-00 Tyrant, which similar to the previous model, this Tyrant would have the familiar claw on his left hand, and his physical stature and appearance are very alike to the previous iteration. But this time around, this monster lacks the necrotic tissue around his body and doesn't have that exposed spinal column as well, and his attacks are very similar to the Proto-Tyrant on how devastating it can be when hit. But in typical Resident Evil fashion, this would be the start on how they usually meet their end with a rocket launcher, which now brings us to the next several models, which was known as the T-100 series, with all their general appearance and stature looking very similar to each other, but with small details that help them stand out amongst the rest of their Tyrant brethren, with one of the more famous of the group would be known as Mr. X. A Tyrant from the T-103 model series, which was a subset from the T-100 series, with this monster's most prominent and initial appearance was in the classic Resident Evil 2 and RE2 remake, where this Tyrant, unlike his previous brethren, would be sent to Raccoon City to eliminate any survivors and retrieve a sample of the G-Virus. Also, a distinguishing factor for this Tyrant was now the added trenchcoat limiter, which helped it absorb a certain amount of damage from firearms, but also helped restrain the Tyrant from mutating into his next form. Also at first, Mr. X would be known to hunt down his prey, showing off how relentless it is and giving us so much tension with his loud and thudding footsteps. Also, this Tyrant would showcase his superhuman strength with his way he could burst through walls or carry individuals with one hand.
Just get me the fuck out of here!
But once released from his trenchcoat limiter, Mr. X would then proceed to his next level, growing massive claws and is now much more dexterous with his movements, and being capable of lunging from one area to the next. But again, with all the depictions that we've seen with Mr. X, like the Tyrants before him, he would have a similar ending as well.
You lose, big guy.
Which now brings us to one of the most famous monsters in the gaming industry, and being known to give us so much tension while being hunted by him, which he's better known as Nemesis. The Tyrant who was the main antagonist in the original Resident Evil 3, as we watch him carry out his orders of eliminating the remaining members of the STARS unit, which at the time during the Raccoon City incident was only Jill Valentine, Brad Vickers, Chris Redfield, Barry Byrne, and Rebecca Chambers. So at this time, Nemesis would be shown as the latest and greatest model to be ever created, having his base foundation similar to the T-103 model that we've seen with Mr. X, but instead would have increased intelligence, better handling, and being much more versatile due to the added implementation of the NE-alpha parasite, a species that was developed by the Umbrella Corporation's European branch, having its objective to be implemented within a viable host, who would then receive the benefits of higher cognitive thinking and being more on the autonomous side, which was displayed by Nemesis during the classic Resident Evil 3 and how resilient he was during the whole game, being the very first Tyrant at the time to follow us from room to room, while at the same time showing greater speed than our characters at full sprint. Also, another benefit from the NE-alpha parasite that Nemesis has is his ability to use the tentacles within his body, both as a way to hold and capture his targets, or use it for his long-range attacks, which in the end really puts him at the pinnacle of the Tyrant models that we've seen during the Resident Evil lore. But with the countless additions and side stories during this franchise, we've also seen countless Tyrants who in a way would match Nemesis in certain aspects, with the first one that we'll cover is Tyrant R, also known as the T-0400 model, which at the time of the Raccoon City incident, this Tyrant was also released, being a subspecies to the T-103 model Tyrants that we saw with Mr. X as well, but this time around, he was genetically improved upon to have increased intelligence and being autonomous with the way it handles its mission. Also, Tyrant R was also created to combat the other Umbrella BOWs in the lineup, with one specifically being the Hunter R, with Umbrella's goal was to acquire battle data when these two BOWs clashed, but Tyrant R would be shown to be very powerful and could handle several hunters at one time. Also is able to override his users' commands and even hunt down the very people who was supposed to be controlling it. But Tyrant R's most intimidating factor would be his Super Tyrant form. Because like Mr. X and Nemesis, once released from his trenchcoat limiter, he would turn into this, looking much more intimidating compared to all the other Tyrants that we've seen so far, while also sporting some rock-like substance all over his body. With the explanation of this is due to the enhanced genetic makeup that this Tyrant has, giving it some additional resistance to some of the firearms used on it. Also, like the other Tyrants that were mentioned, this behemoth can move very well and is shown to be pretty dexterous regardless of its hulking size. But talking about being very dexterous and versatile, let's go ahead and move on to the next Tyrant in the lineup, which was known as the Morpheus Tyrant, which this iteration distinguishes itself from the others by having a feminine build compared to the hulking monsters that we've seen so far. Though don't let that fool you, because in actuality, this Tyrant is actually a male whose original identity was Morpheus Duval, a former employee of the Umbrella Corporation, who was blamed for some gross negligence that helped cause the spill of the T-Virus close to the events to the first 3 games in the Resident Evil lineup, causing him to turn his back on the Umbrella Corporation and devoting his life to rid the whole world of ugliness and imperfections, which his means of doing this is by destroying the current world we live in and forming a new one based off the perceived beauty that he's envisioned, which in this case, he would use a combination of the T and G virus, and initially use it to threaten the world, but would then later on infect himself with a combination of the virus, and see him turn into the Tyrant like we mentioned earlier, with the more feminine physique, the faster and nimble movements, and the surprising ability to speak in coherent sentences.
A scared little rat with an ugly, useless gun. Morpheus?
With the only one who could compare when it comes to Tyrant speaking is Nemesis, but with the Morpheus Tyrant's retained intelligence, it allowed Duval to be so potent with his newfound powers and still being cognitively intact. But of course, during Resident Evil Dead Aim, this elegant appearance would change into a more hideous blob form after taking in so much damage, which could be due to the G-Virus aspect of the combo virus that he took in, being very similar to William Birkin's final mutation, where he too had the hideous blob form as well, which in a way is a massive flaw when it comes to this Tyrant, since we know most will eventually sustain a lot of damage. So mutating into this grotesque form doesn't help one bit, which the next Tyrant we'll talk about doesn't have the same attributes once taking damage. If anything, it has the capabilities to continually adapt and become a stronger version of itself, which in this case, this monster is known as the Hypnos Tyrant, and the aspects that help this BOW stand out from his other Tyrant brethren is the inclusion of the Hypnos gene within his genetic makeup, giving this monster the ability to continuously reproduce stronger cells and ridding itself of its weaker ones, which is a similar aspect to natural selection, which in essence makes this Tyrant stronger and stronger. But like his other Tyrant brethren, with the continuous sustained damage throughout the game, it too will mutate into a more primal and monstrous form, bearing large claws and having that distinct heart outside of his chest wall to provide extra vital capacity once it bulks up. Also, even with a larger and more intimidating form, he still retains a lot of speed, very similar to the Tyrant R's. Anyway, so far, the Tyrants from the side games have stood out in their own way, even when they slightly resemble their T100 series brethren, and their particular way of mutating into the next form is similar as well. But as we move on to the final 3 Tyrants, let's quickly do some honorable mentions to what I call pseudo-Tyrants, which are BOWs who bear some familiar traits like the Tyrants, but didn't stem from the same origin or had some determining factor that excluded them from the group, which the first honorable mention would be Glenn Arias Virus from the movie Resident Evil Vendetta, because with this lunatic, he had the potential to cause thousands to lose their lives, but also had the bright idea to kidnap Rebecca Chambers so he could try to recreate the wedding where he lost his wife. Though by the end of the movie, he would merge with one of his associates and would become a pseudo-tyrant-like monster, who like the Morpheus tyrant still retained so much intelligence and was able to produce coherent sentences as well. Also, of course, his stature is similar to those tyrants that we mentioned before, but he seemed to be able to control his elongated claws at will, which I thought was a pretty cool aspect to have. Anyways, the next monster who deserves an honorable mention is Jack Norman from Resident Evil Revelations and his pseudo-tyrant-like form after infecting himself with the T-Abyss virus, granting him a similar stature to the tyrants, but also giving him a large claw in his left hand and the famous trait of having a heart outside of his chest wall. But his most prominent feature would be the ability to teleport towards his targets, which I thought was pretty amazing.
Norman, stop! Morgan isn't here!
It's no use. He's gone over the edge.
Anyways, the next honorable mention would be Neil Fisher from Resident Evil Revelations and how he became a pseudo-tyrant-like monster as well.
Ouroboros! It's not death! It's
where he was granted so much muscle mass and would definitely show his superhuman-like strength to Claire during this boss battle. Anyways, last but not least, when it comes to our honorable mentions of pseudo-tyrants, he would be a BOW who would be a spiritual successor to Nemesis, which this monster that I'm talking about is Ustanok from Resident Evil 6.
Okay, we go with your plan.
With his tyrant-like appearance, his intelligence when being given orders, and the overall versatility he's shown when using all of his mechanical arms really made him stand out, giving us players a different kind of twist when dealing with a tyrant-like monster who can switch his weapons of choice depending on the location and situation. Anyways, with these honorable mentions out of the way, let's quickly go over the last 3 tyrants in the lineup, which 2 of them did make their appearance in Resident Evil Code Veronica, being the Bandersnatch and the T-078 tyrant that we fought on the cargo plane, which we could actually start a conversation with the Bandersnatch and why this smaller and less humanoid monster would be considered a tyrant, because remember in the early part of the video, when I mentioned that these tyrants are very rare to produce due to the lack of viability of individuals who can become one, so the Bandersnatch project was created so that Umbrella was able to produce these less proficient and cost-effective forms of tyrants, even if they did have a major deformity with their overall body structure, but nonetheless, these creatures would still hold their own when it comes to battle, being able to stretch their elongated arms to either attack from afar or drag itself closer to their targets. But the prominent tyrant in Code Veronica would be seen towards the middle portion of the game, which was showcased being a subspecies of the T-103 models like Mr. X, but this time around, his main appearance would be the lack of a trenchcoat limiter like his tyrant brethren, and had a club-like arm for him to use as a weapon. Anyways, with this tyrant, he doesn't fully transform like the others, not showing any kind of large claws or teeth, and lacking that heart outside of his chest wall. But what this tyrant does have is the outrageous superhuman strength, which in Darkside Chronicles depicted him to be able to withstand a missile for a long period of time, which already is a feat in itself. Anyways, the very last tyrant in the lineup is the most advanced in the storyline and probably the tallest of the bunch, which were the tyrants from Resident Evil Damnation, and how they were pretty much an improved version of the T-103 models that we've seen so far, almost being Titan-like, and their trenchcoat limiter really depicted them to be this heavy armored beings. With each of their footsteps can be heard and felt, extenuating the aspect of how heavy and powerful they truly were. Also, their larger than life stature doesn't hinder their overall speed, as we've seen them be able to run at full sprint. But like their previous tyrant iterations before them, they too can mutate into their super tyrant form, gaining claws and showing off their speed and strength as well, with the only way they were stopped was by a direct hit from a fighter jet. Anyway, so far, with all the depictions that we've learned from all the tyrants throughout the years, all this culminates to the very latest version of Nemesis in Resident Evil 3 Remake, because remember that Nemesis was already such an adversary in the original RE3, but if we've learned one thing from RE2 Remake, I'm sure they'll improve upon Nemesis like they did with Mr. X, and making him much more ferocious as ever, bringing us the pinnacle version of what a tyrant would be like in today's gaming environment, possibly adding more weapons for Nemesis to use, being much more clever and versatile with the way he uses his tentacles, and showing off his intelligence when trying to hunt down the remaining STARS members during RE3 Remake. So all in all, I can't wait to see what Nemesis will be like, and we can safely assume that the previous tyrant iterations before him did help the devs create this monster to be the absolute and best version of a tyrant they can have just prior to the end of the PS4 console cycle. Anyways, what do you guys think about all the countless tyrants throughout their franchise, and which one was your favorite? Please let me know and why on the comment section down below. Also, if you guys want more Resident Evil lore and content, then check these videos out on my channel where we talk about specific character analysis or backstories to certain aspects in the Resident Evil franchise. So without any further ado, this is Hey Deva, and I'll see you guys on the next video.